The night the girl found me, the wind came down off the mountains like something alive, shaking the boards of my cabin and creeping through every seam a man could never quite seal. I was oiling a saddle by lantern light, listening to the horses blow steam into the dark when I heard it, a sound that did not belong to wolves or wind or the groan of timber. It was small, but it carried. A knock, then another, then a third, like a frightened heart practicing how to be brave. I took my rifle because a lonely man learns that caution is a better prayer than most, and I opened the door a crack. The world outside was powdered white and whirling, but there she stood, a thin thing with a shawl that might have been a curtain, one snow beating on her lashes and melting tracks down skin, too pale for a child of the high country. In her arms she held a bundle wrapped in faded green cloth, and the bundle moved. Two brown eyes stared out at me, wide and wet, not crying, just watching as if they had spent all their tears already and were saving the last of them for something that really needed it. The girl swallowed. Her voice came raw, like it had been dragged over gravel. "Is your name Jonah Hayes?" It was though I hadn't heard it spoken by another soul in months. I lifted the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in before the night takes you." She stepped in like someone taught her to be careful around luck, not to startle it. The green bundle scrunched and let out one low kitten sort of sound. I set the rifle against the wall and stoked the stove-coaxing flame into a better temper. The light found the girl's face and showed me a thin scar cutting down from her eyebrow to the curve of her cheek, white against windburn. Her left eye followed me. Her right did not. The bundle was a baby, maybe 8 months, cheeks chapped. Breath edged with a rattle I did not like. "What's your name?" I asked, because names are a kind of shelter too. "Marin," she said, "and this is Ian." "Where are your people, Marin?" She looked at the door as if the answer were out there, hidden in the spinning white. "South, maybe? Or nowhere. I don't know anymore." I put a kettle on and fetched one of the blankets that still held the faint smell of lilac oil, a smell I had been avoiding for a year and a half. Marin watched my hands with a fox attention. I had the thought that if I turned my back too long, she might not be there when I turned again, might vanish like the sound of a song you imagine but never truly hear. The baby coughed, a soft, bubbling thing. I reached for the instinct that grief hadn't managed to strip from me and warmed a cup-thin milk with water, sweetened it just enough to make it slide. Marin held him while I touched the cup to his lips. He drank like he did not know how to trust it, yet then like he did not know how to stop. When he finished, Marin wiped his mouth with the edge of the green cloth. Her hands were red from the cold and raw in the knuckles. She did not ask for anything for herself. "You walked in that storm," I said. "How far?" "Long enough," she said. "Do you have reason to think someone is behind you?" She pressed her lips together. The way a child learns not to tell is a kind of wound, and I knew better than to tear a scab the first night. Still, I took a breath, trying to place the prickle in my neck. "You said my name like you meant to say it, Marin. Who sent you to me?" Her eye found mine and held. "They said you used to fix iron and shoes, and that you had a good back and a decent heart. They said you were stubborn with what you thought was right. They said if anyone would help, it would be the man who lost everything and was still breathing. They who wainan in Hasser." Her mouth shaped the word like it might cut. "The sisters at St. Clair's." I didn't know the sisters at St. Clair's had a map with my name on it. Maybe word moves through a territory the way water finds the cracks. I nodded. "What did you lose, Marin?" She flinched so small I might have missed it if I hadn't been looking. "Most things, but not him." Her eyes moved to the baby. "Not him if I can help it." I put water and flour in a bowl and worked dough until it came together. Marin watched my hands like the way bread is made might be a secret worth learning. When the dough was near enough, I slid it to warm at the back of the stove and ladled stew from the pot that never quite emptied. She took the bowl, and before she ate, she broke the bread, cleaned down the middle left half wrapped in cloth on the table, and put the other half to her mouth. "You can eat it all," I said. She shook her head. "Tomorrow is long." "Tomorrow is shorter with a full belly," I said, but I didn't push it. I'd learned you can offer safety to a creature that's been hunted, but it will take time before the creature trusts the meadow. When she finished, I showed her the small room that had been empty since the day I packed the trunk and shut the lid like that could keep what was inside from spilling into the rest of the house. The bed was narrow and clean. The quilt was one my wife had sewn, pieced from calico, that knew a softer county than this one. Marin stood in the doorway and looked like touching the air might make it all go away. You can sleep here, I said. I'll keep the fire. We'll talk in the morning. She didn't move. The baby in her arms had begun to breathe quieter. She pressed her cheek to his hair and said almost too soft to hear he has a fever that comes and goes and a cough that stays. I know that sound, I said, and the memory came like cold lake water on a hot day. Fast, shocking, making you breathe hard whether you wanted to or not. I tamped it down because grief is a poor midwife, and we had a child that needed living help. I have linseed and honey and the doctor's powder for when the lungs tighten. We'll see him through the night. Marin nodded like she wanted to believe me and needed practice. She set the baby on the bed to tuck the quilt around him, and that was when I saw the bruise peeking from under her collar, the yellowing edge where purple had been. The scar on her face was old. This was not. Who did this? I asked quieter than a whisper. She pulled the shawl up as if the cloth could change the past. A man who thinks everything is his. Does he have a name? She bit the word. Harris Crow. I did not know Harris Crow, but I knew the type. A man who learned that fear gets you quicker results than kindness and never bothered to learn anything else. I put another log on the fire and listened to its pop and settle. Will he come, I asked, if he thinks he can profit by it. I was about to ask profit how when the world answered for her. Hooves drummed out on the packed snow beyond the barn. Not one pair. More. 4 or 5 at least. I could feel the counting in my ribs. The horses in my lean-to stamped and blew sharp with alarm. Marin went still. The baby slept on his breath a small whistle. I took the rifle and blew out the lantern, leaving only the stove glow to hold the dark at bay. Marin drew back from the window's edge and I stepped to it. Out in the falling white shapes moved slow, deliberate the way men move when they believe the night is theirs. A voice rose, practiced and dry like someone who sells words for a living and keeps the good ones for himself. Jonah Hayes, the man called. We know you are inside. We come on business. Sell us what is owed and we will leave your roof untroubled. I did not owe a man like that anything. But I had learned some debts are claimed by force if you do not name them first. I looked at Moran and the child sleeping under a quilt with lilac ghosts sewn in the seams, and I knew same as I knew the look of a storm belly that the quiet life I had been keeping like a fragile jar on a shelf was about to shatter. Stay in the room, I told Marin. If I say the word north, you take the boy and slip out the back, follow the creek bed to the old trapper's shed, and you do not look behind you. If I do not say the word, you do not move. Do you understand? She nodded. Her one good eye was bright and steady, and I thought not for the first time that courage comes in sizes most men never notice. I set my hand on the latch, lifted it, and stepped into the cold to meet whatever the night had brought to my door. The men fanned themselves across the yard like they had practiced it a calm half circle that put my door in the arc of their rifles while leaving them far enough apart that one bullet would not learn 2 lessons. The one in front wore a coat the color of old pennies and a hat with a weather stain that had the shape of a hand on it. He sat his horse like a man who never lifted a shovel, only pens and other men. When he smiled, it did not reach his eyes. Harris Crow, he said, making an introduction a kind of claim. Friendly to law and commerce. We come to collect what is owed and escort what is under bond. Talk plain, and we will talk pleasant. I stepped off the porch and shut the door behind me so the warm would not bleed out. Snow moved sideways in fine sheets caught by the ridge wind and thrown back at the mountain like a challenge. I leaned my shoulder to one of the porch posts and felt the old pine creak, the wood reminding me it had been under other storms and come through. I do not reckon I owe you, Crow, I said, and I do not escort strangers under my roof at night. If your business touches my land, you can say it in daylight and with a paper that does not melt. His horse pawed and blew impatient. Crow patted its neck in a practiced show of gentleness that meant nothing. You shelter a girl and an infant who are contracted to my supervision by agreement. Sworn in town, he said. Their board and maintenance are obligations attached to assets still unsettled. The guardian has delegated care. I am that delegation. He tipped his head as if the matter were ironclad. I will take them now. There are sentences that sound lawful and smell rotten. I did not know the papers he spoke of, but I knew the shape of a man who kept his authority in a pocket instead of his heart. Bring the guardian, I said. Let the girl stand where there is light and choose where her feet wish to be. Till then, my door's shut. One of the men, a square-shouldered fellow with 2 fingers missing, spat into the snow. You hear that, boss? He thinks a door stops winter? Crow did not look at him. He only watched me weighing. Men like him are accountants of fear. They mark columns for bluster and columns for steel, and if the numbers do not favor them, they add force until they do. He lifted one gloved hand palm outward, and his men settled the small shift of leather and wood like the breath a room takes before someone says the thing that cannot be unsaid. A child taken from supervision is a kind of debt, Crow said. Debt has remedies. He drew something from inside his coat and held it up. Even in that weather, even through the distance and dim, I knew the shape of a seal the judge used. The red wax had the right scallop to its edge. The paper looked proper. He let me see it and then put it away as if the glimpse were favor enough. That paper belongs where a stove burns, I said. Not in a snow yard. I will not read a thing tonight that asks me to hand a child to a stranger. If you mean to serve, come with son and the marshal, and we will begin with names in the girl's own mouth. The man with 2 missing fingers laughed a sound without mirth. He thinks the marshal is his aunt, he said. Crow still did not look at him. He continued studying me as if I were a ledger whose columns might balance if he wrote the numbers hard enough. He shrugged at last, a motion so small you might mistake it for a settling of the shoulders against the cold. Dawn, then, he said. If you value the clean line of law, make your coffee early. We will bring eyes to witness. He turned his horse. The half-circle unhooked and flowed after him like a hinge closing. In the time it took for the snow to swallow their shapes, the yard grew empty again. The barn horses shifted, easing down from the edge they had found. I stood there a few breaths more, listening for the mistake my nerves were certain would announce itself if I waited. Nothing came but the usual small noises of a place that means to live. I went inside, latched the door, and set the bar. The heat reached for me with welcome. Marn was where I had left her, standing back from the window. The shawl drawn close, but her jaw set like she had been chewing iron to make her teeth remember their purpose. Harris Crow, I said. She nodded. Her voice, when it came, was flat. He works with men who loan men who write things into ledgers. He says I am an entry in a book. He says Ian is another. She looked toward the room. The baby slept on his breath, a faster rill now that the milk sat warm in his belly. She swallowed and went on. My stepfather worked claims for a company Crow is tied to. He died under a log. They say it was an accident, but the log looked like it had been lifted and set to fall. Someone drew a crow with a knife on the stump after a sign. The sisters said Crow would try to sell me to an East train if I stayed in town. Said there are always men who buy girls to work in places without windows. They hid me and wrote your name on a scrap and said, go north and find the man who used to fix iron. They said you do not sell people. I pulled a chair out and sat because grief has its own gravity, and sometimes standing under it makes a man sway. I do not sell people, I said. She looked at me to see if my mouth was lying. I held the look and let it pass through me and back to her. Something given, not forced. He had a paper, I said. A seal like a judge's. I'd swear by the shape of it in poor light. If it is true and not a thing pressed in a back room, then the morning will bring arguing. I will not hand you to him. But if the marshal comes and the paper is what it pretends to be, we will have to make a path that is narrow and true. There is a woman in town who remembers what honor feels like. Ada Lowell. She keeps the general store, and she keeps people when they are afraid. If it comes to it, we will make appeal where there is still breath of kindness. Marin nodded, not hopeful so much as willing to hold a thread and see if it did not break. I took a kettle and made steam a half-tent of blanket over bowl and child. A pinch of powder from a blue tin the doctor had sold me when the last winter took what I loved. The smell opened the nose and sat the chest up. Ian coughed, then settled. I laid my hand above his ribs and felt the small lift and fall, the rhythm of a life that has not yet learned how treacherous a winter can be. Sleep if you can, I said. I will keep watch. She did not lie down. She sat in the chair by the bed and leaned her head against the wall, one hand over the quilt where the boy's back rose. Her eyes slid closed and opened and closed again, stubborn with duty, even in exhaustion. I put another log on, then went to the door and opened it, a finger's width. The yard sat under a black sky salted with stray stars. The snow a mutter. On the corner fence post someone had left a A slivered piece of wood with a crude crow scratched into it tied with a strip of red cloth. I took it down and broke it across my knee. The crack was sharp a sound for the cold to carry. I tossed the pieces into the stove and watched the bird curl and blacken and then go to ash. Toward morning, the wind fell into breath instead of accusation. A gray installed itself above the ridge and grew, pushing night into the gulches. I stoked the stove-boiled coffee to a strength that could stand by a man in a hard hour and cut bread. Marin woke with a start and then remembered where she was and who the room belonged to. The boy's cheeks held a little pink. His breath still rattled at the edges, but less like a door about to blow in, and more like a door that fit again. "Eat," I said, and she did, breaking the habit of saving half this once without thinking about it, which told me some part of her was beginning to accept the room as more than a pause. The hooves came before the cup was empty. Not the careless pace of men who think they own what they are riding toward, but a steadier rhythm official. I stepped to the window and saw three figures. The lead wore a coat with a badge pinned where the pocket would be. The two behind rode with the look of men who had opinions and would keep them for later. I unbarred the door and opened it to the morning and the men. The marshal tipped his hat the smallest inch. "Jonah," he said, "there's a matter to set straight. I have papers, and I have questions, and I have a girl's word to weigh against a seal." Marin stood behind me, not hiding, not bold, just there. The marshal's gaze flicked to her, and then to the room beyond, to the warm and the small quilt-curled shape on the bed. He looked back at me and sighed like a man who understands he has been handed a knot and only his hands to unwork it. "Let's bring it into the light, then," I said, and I stepped aside to let the morning and its trouble into my home. The marshal came in, first careful to stomp the snow from his boots. He had the kind of calm that makes a man more dangerous, a quiet that came from carrying too many stories with endings he hadn't chosen. His name was Thomas Reeves, and we had crossed paths once before. Years back when my wife was still alive, and Frost Creek was only beginning to pretend it was a town. The two men behind him followed slower, one carrying a satchel, the other a folded paper wrapped in oilcloth. Marin stood straight, the shawl pulled tight, though the heat from the stove had turned the air soft. She didn't move when the marshal nodded to her, only dipped her chin once like she'd been called by name too often by men who didn't mean well. The baby Ian slept in the small bed, breathing steady for now, unaware of the new shape of danger in the room. "You got yourself in the middle of something heavy," Jonah Reeves said, setting his hat on the table. "Crow came to town last week waving a guardianship order signed by Judge Hallow. Says the girl and the child belong under his supervision until certain debts of her stepfather are settled. Says she ran away with what's his." I kept my hands easy flat on the table. "A man can write anything on paper, Marshal. Doesn't make it the truth." Reeves motioned to the satchel. The man beside him pulled out a ledger, the ink crisp even in the dull morning light. "You're not wrong," Reeves said. "Judge's seal looks right, but the handwriting's different. We'll get to that. What I need to know first is whether you're holding her against her will." "No," Marin said, her voice barely a breath. "He saved us." The marshal looked at her, eyes steady. "From who?" She swallowed. "From Harris Crow. He said I was payment. Said the baby was worth more if sold separate. He hit me when I wouldn't agree. So I ran." She reached up and touched the pale scar that cut through her eyebrow. "That one wasn't from him, but the bruise on my neck was." Reeves listened without writing anything down. After a moment, he exhaled. "I've heard stories about Crow. Trouble is stories ain't evidence, and men like him collect favors from every judge they pour whiskey for. You understand the corner that puts us in?" I nodded. "I understand a child's cough doesn't wait for courts to argue." He gave me a tired smile. "Still got that tongue of yours." Then he turned to his men. "Let's see the document." The paper came out of its oilcloth, laid flat on my table. The seal shone dull red. The ink along the top line had bled where moisture had kissed it, but the name stood clear: Harris Crow, appointed guardian of Marin Gall and infant male ward, Ian Gall, by order of Judge Samuel Hallow. The handwriting did look off. The signature curved with a flourish. I remembered from Hallow's pen, but the strokes beneath were heavier, less certain, like someone tracing a line he didn't understand. Reeves traced it with one finger. "Could be forgery," he muttered. "Could also be the judge's hand on a bad day after too much rye." Marin stepped forward. He had more papers. One said I was pledged to a rail agent down in Denver. Said he could collect after the thaw. That caught Reeves's eye. You saw the agent's name? She nodded. Vance R. Vance, he wore gloves even inside. Reeves whistled through his teeth. R. Vance. Been chasing him 3 years. Man buys indentures for orphan trains. Resells them down south to mines and saloons. Last rumor put him working with Crow. He looked at me. Now you see the mire I'm in. The law on paper says one thing, the law in a man's gut says another. If I drag her back to town under that seal, I'll be doing Crow's work. If I don't, he'll have every creditor in the county filing complaint by nightfall. Then maybe you do neither, I said. Maybe you look the other way long enough for the truth to walk into daylight. Reeves studied me a long while. I remember Martha, he said quietly. You buried her up near the cottonwood. She'd want you to do what's right, not what's easy. But right's going to cost. I've been paying for years, I said. The silence after that wasn't unfriendly, just heavy. He finally folded the document and handed it to the man with the satchel. Take this back to Frost Creek, he said. Have Miss Lowell compare it to the contracts in her store. She keeps records for half the valley. If it's false, she'll know. The men left riding back into the gray, leaving only the Marshal Marin and me in the room. The baby stirred and coughed. Reeves glanced at him. He'll need medicine, he said. The doctor in Frost Creek keeps syrup of ammonia and laudanum for lungs that wet. I'll send some back up with the riders. Marin brushed the boy's hair, whispering something too soft to catch. The small sound of it, that mother's hum, carried through the space like the opposite of gunfire. The marshal pulled on his gloves. Jonah, you got a day, maybe 2 before Crow tries again. He'll bring men, maybe papers, maybe fire. Get ready, but don't let your anger write the ending. If that paper proves false, I'll come back with a warrant. If it proves true, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. After he left, the quiet pressed close. I set a pot on the stove, poured what coffee was left into tin cups. Marin sat across from me, her face drawn but steady. You trust him, she said. As far as any man wearing a badge can be trusted in a town owned by debts, I said. But he's got some truth still living in him. That's more than most. She nodded. If he doesn't come back, then we find our own road. Outside, the sun tried to break through the overcast, a thin gold bleeding along the ridge. The barn roof still carried last night's snow, heavy and silent. The world looked calm, but calm on the frontier was like glass over deep water, one thrown stone, and you saw what was underneath. We spent the next hours mending what could be mended. I fixed a hinge on the back door, laid a new log wall where the wind crept in. Marin scrubbed the pans, humming low, and for a time it almost felt like the life I used to have, 2 people working in quiet rhythm, each pretending not to be waiting for something to break. By evening, the tracks from the marshal's horses had filled with new snow. Marin fed the baby, wrapped him close, and dozed by the fire. I stepped out onto the porch, listening to the land breathe. No movement, no sound but the distant crack of ice loosening in the creek. Then far off, too far for comfort, came a single shot. Not a fight, not a warning. Just one. The kind that says someone testing the cold or sending a message. I waited for another. None came. When I went back inside, Marin's eyes were open. He's coming, isn't he? She asked. Crow doesn't take no for an answer, I said. He'll come with night. She tightened her hold on the baby. Then we'll meet him together. I looked at her. Then not as a stray, not as a burden, but as someone the world had already tried to break and failed. She was 8 years younger than I had been when loss first found me, and already she had learned that courage is not loud. It's quiet, steady, and it stays. I banked the fire and checked the rifle leaning by the door. Outside, the dark began to thicken, and the wind carried a scent of smoke that wasn't mine. That was how the longest night began. By full dark, the snow had stopped falling, and the cold took its place, a sharp, still cold that made every sound travel too far. The stars hung low and hard, so clear they looked cut from tin. I'd been sitting by the window for an hour, rifle across my knees, watching the line where the trees met the open pasture. It wasn't fear that kept me there. It was knowing. When a man like Harris Crow made a threat, he came back to see it finished. Marin was in the small room, the baby asleep in her arms. Every so often, she'd hum that soft tune again, and the sound ran through the house like a thread holding it together. I had the lamps turned low. Only the fire gave light, a steady orange pulse against the log walls. Around midnight, the dogs began to growl. Not the kind of noise they make for deer or fox. This was a warning sound, a deep rumble that starts in the gut. I stood step to the window. At first there was nothing, only the glint of frost on the fence posts. Then movement, a horse's shadow sliding between trees, another behind it. 3, 4, then more. I couldn't tell how many, but enough to make my chest tighten. They came slow, not rushing it, trusting the dark. I could make out torches now, the orange light licking through the pines. I went to the bedroom door. Maren looked up the moment I opened it. "It's time," I said. She nodded, already standing. "The cellar. Take the boy. If you hear the word north, you run. You don't stop." Her face was pale but set. "And you?" "I stay. You can't fight them all." "I don't have to. I just have to buy time for the sun to find us again." She hesitated, like she wanted to say something, then turned and slipped into the dark hallway. The trap door creaked once, then shut. I waited until I heard the latch drop from below. Then I blew out the lanterns. The house went black, except for the small flickering light from the stove. Outside, the torches moved closer. I could hear the creak of saddles, the soft jingle of harness. I loaded the rifle and set it by the window. Beside it lay the shotgun, both barrels clean and oiled. Crow's voice came through the cold like a saw through wood. "Jonah Hayes, open the door. We'll have our talk now." "Talk's better done in daylight," I said, not loud, but he'd hear it. A laugh came back, followed by the scrape of boots on frozen ground. "You think the dark's your friend? You built a life out here in it, but I own it. The law says those children are mine. The marshal's gone soft, but the ink's still dry. You give me the girl and you keep your skin." I kept quiet. Silence can do more than words when men are listening for weakness. He stepped closer. I could see him now, torchlight painting his face in streaks. Behind him, half a dozen men fanned out. One carried a jug, sloshing, something that smelled like oil. My barn still bore the scorch from his last message. He was aiming to finish what he'd started. I chambered a round and fired a single shot over their heads. The crack tore through the stillness. One of the horses reared. "Next one finds a mark," I said. Crow shouted something I couldn't catch. One of his men darted left, and the torch he carried arced toward the cabin. I fired again. The torch went spinning into the snow, hissing out. The men pulled back behind the corral fence. Crow's voice rose colder now. "You're digging your grave, Hayes. When the law comes, it'll find your body in my paper, and it'll know who was right." "Bring your law, then," I said. "But come daylight, I don't open my door to thieves at night." A pause. The horses shifted. For a moment, I thought he might charge. Then a whistle, sharp 2 notes, and the torches began to fall back into the trees. They were leaving, or pretending to. I kept my eyes on the dark for a long time, waiting for the second act of the trick. None came. When the last light disappeared, I let out the breath I'd been holding. But relief's a liar. As I turned from the window, the faintest flicker of glow caught my eye through the far pane at the barn. It wasn't torchlight this time. It was flame, small but sure, crawling up the haystack side. I ran out without thinking. The cold cut my face open. The fire was climbing fast, feeding on dry straw and pine pitch. I pulled the door wide, tried to loose the horses. They bolted, tails high, snow spraying behind them. In the roar and smoke, I barely heard the crack of the rifle until the splinter flew off the doorpost by my head. I dove behind a trough. The next shot hit the wall where my shoulder had been. They weren't gone after all. They'd flanked me. I raised the rifle and fired once toward the tree line. A cry answered back, then another shot closer. Sparks fell like stars around me. I crawled to the fence, rolled under it, and made for the cabin. My breath came in white bursts. The snow glowed orange behind me. Inside, I barred the door again, coughing from the smoke on my coat. The baby had started crying below the floor, the sound muffled but sharp. Maren whispered something, trying to hush him. The night went quiet again, too quiet. I crouched by the window, listening. A sound came then, faint but distinct, the low horn of a horse approaching from the south trail. A single rider, not fast, just steady. I raised the rifle, peered through the glass. The rider stopped short of the yard, lifted something in his hand. The torchlight from the burning barn caught the glint of a badge. Reeves. He'd come back. Behind him, more riders followed, 5, 6 men from town, some I recognized even at a distance. Miguel Santos from the mill, Beatrice Hollis with her husband's shotgun, Dr. Harrison clutching his bag. The townsfolk. The marshal's voice cut through the night. "Crow, I've got a warrant and 50 witnesses. Step out where we can see you. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then from the woods came a shout, the crack of gunfire, the scream of a horse. I saw Crow's men scatter. The fight was short. When it ended, the only fire left was the barn burning itself to ash. Reeves rode into the yard, face blackened from smoke. "You alive, Jonah?" "Mostly," I said, opening the door. Marin climbed from the cellar, baby still in her arms. The marshal took one look at her, then at me. "We found Crow's men hiding by the ridge. One's dead, two wounded." Crow himself ran. "He won't get far." "He's hurt." "The paper?" I asked. "Forged," Reeves said. Miss Lowell matched the ink. "Crow bought the seal from a peddler, faked the rest." "You're clear." Marin sank onto the nearest chair, her hands shaking. The baby fussed, then quieted as she held him close. Reeves rubbed his jaw. "There'll be a trial. Might take time, but he'll hang for the fires, if not the lies." He looked at me. "You did right to stand." I looked through the doorway at the ruin of my barn. The roof had fallen in the snow, hissing where it touched ember. "Standing costs," I said. He nodded, "Always does." When the marshal and his riders left, dawn was beginning to thin the sky. I sat on the porch steps while Marin fed the child. The cold bit my hands, but the air smelled clean again, stripped of smoke. "What happens now?" she asked. "You stay," I said, "till the town sorts itself." She looked down at the baby. "We'll help rebuild." I smiled a little at that. One day at a time. In the distance, a crow called out from a dead pine. The sound echoed over the snowfield. For the first time in years, I didn't mind it. Sometimes even the blackest birds just mean mornings come again. The winter sun stayed weak for a week after the fire. Mornings came pale, afternoons shorter than a prayer, and nights carried a silence that seemed to listen back. The barn lay black and skeletal against the snow, a rib cage left by something too big to bury. Marin helped where she could, though her arms still ached from smoke and cold. I watched her carry water, gather eggs from what chickens we'd saved, and sing to the boy when he fussed. She did these things the way people breathe, without thinking, without asking if they should. The marshal's riders came and went, following Crow's trail north toward the pass. He had vanished clean, leaving only the tracks of a horse ridden too hard. Reeves stopped by every few days, bringing supplies, news, and the weight of what couldn't be said. The town had split itself down the middle, half saying, "I'd done what any man should," the other half whispering that I'd harbored thieves and murderers. Law in a place like Frost Creek had never been more than opinion written in ink that faded too quick. One night when the wind turned soft and the moon hung like tarnish above the ridge, Marin asked, "Why did you stay here after your family died? You could have gone anywhere." I was mending a bridle, the smell of oil and leather sharp in the air. I thought about lying, saying it was the land or the horses or the work, but those were just the excuses a man makes when he can't name the truth. "Because leaving felt like letting go of them," I said. "As long as I kept the fire burning here, it was like they might still walk through the door one day." Foolish thing, but grief makes a fool of most of us. She nodded slowly. "The sisters said sorrow either hardens you or hollows you out, but maybe it can make room instead." I smiled at that. "You sound older than you are." "So do you," she said, and for the first time since that night, we both laughed, quiet surprise, like people learning how again. When spring began to hint itself along the creek, Reeves brought word that the trial was set for May. Crow had been caught near the border, shot through the shoulder, and left half dead in a trapper's shed. They'd bring him back under guard to stand before Judge Hallow himself, the same man whose seal he'd stolen. "You'll need to come testify," the marshal said. "Her too, if she's willing. It'll be rough. Crow's got lawyers and friends with long pockets, but truth's got longer legs than greed." Marin agreed without hesitation. "I'll tell them everything." I watched her then, how steady she was, how little of the frightened child remained. In her place stood someone tempered, shaped by winter and mercy both. The morning we rode to Frost Creek, the snow still clung to the northern slopes, melting in slow silver threads. Marin rode beside me, her shawl tied close, the baby asleep against her chest. Folks stopped to stare as we passed the widow's cabin, burned but rebuilt, the man who'd shot it out with debt collectors. The girl, they said, belonged to him now. Gossip has its own weather in a town like that. I let it blow where it pleased. In court, Crow looked smaller. The fine coat was gone, replaced by rough cloth and a sling. His face had the waxy look of a man used to control and now starved of it. When Marin spoke, the room went still. She told everything: the papers, the threats the night he came for her, the way he'd called the child property. Her voice shook once, just once, when she said the words he'd used about the train east. By the time she finished, even Judge Hallow's hands had gone white around the edge of his bench. When it was my turn, I told the truth plain, how I'd found her in the snow, what I'd seen on her face, what kind of marks a man's fists leave when they stop asking permission. I told how Crow had forged a seal and tried to burn us alive. The lawyer shouted objection after objection until the judge raised a hand. "I've heard enough," he said. "The court finds the papers fraudulent, the guardianship void, and the acts of Harris Crow criminal under both civil and moral law." Crow tried to stand shouting about debts and property, but the guards pressed him down. The judge's gavel fell once hard enough to echo like thunder. When it stopped, the room breathed again. Afterward, Reeves found us outside the courthouse. The wind carried the smell of wet pine and horses. "He'll hang come summer," the marshal said, "but I doubt you'll want to see it." "No," I said, "I've seen enough dying." We rode back in silence. At the cabin, the melted snow had left the earth soft and dark. Marin stood looking at the place where the barn had been. "We could plant there," she said. "Corn, maybe. Something that grows tall." "You sure you want to stay?" I asked. She looked at me with that one steady eye. "This place saved us. It deserves something that lives." So we dug. Day after day, we turned black soil with spades until the calluses on our hands matched mine. The first shoots came shyly through the dirt green as new hope. The barn we rebuilt together, slower this time, stronger. Miguel brought timber, Beatrice lent nails, and even the marshal stopped by to swing a hammer. One evening when the walls were up and the roof set, I found Marin standing by the doorway watching the sun drop behind the ridge. The light caught her hair, turning it the color of copper. Ian slept in a sling against her chest, his breath soft and even. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Once I said, but the road never offered what the land kept. She smiled faint but sure. "Then maybe this is home." The word struck something inside me I hadn't known was still there. Home. I'd called it a cabin, a ranch, a graveyard, but never that. We went inside and I lit the lamp. Outside, the last snow melted into streams that whispered through the valley. The corn shoots bent in the breeze, small but certain. For the first time since Martha and my boy were gone, I felt the quiet settle, not as emptiness, but as peace. The mountains don't forgive easily, but sometimes they grant you one more season. I reckoned we'd earned ours. The seasons turned quiet that year. By June, the corn stood knee-high, the pasture green again, where the snow melt had run heavy. The days stretched long and the nights softened, losing the hard edge of winter. The ranch no longer felt like a place haunted by what was gone. It was something new, something breathing. Marin had learned the rhythm of the land as though she'd always known it. She could set a snare milk the goats mend a tear with a stitch so neat you could barely see it. Every evening she read aloud from the worn Bible Martha had kept not for sermon, but for the sound of words that made the room feel lived in. Sometimes I'd answer her with a story from the trail, something foolish from the years before loss had hollowed me out. She'd laugh, soft but real, and the baby would wake and join in with his little noise, a sound that made even the walls warmer. Then one afternoon, the marshal rode up the valley again. I saw the dust before I saw him. Reeves looked tired, lines, deeper beard grayer. He dismounted, slow eyes scanning the fields before settling on me. "Didn't expect to see you this far north again," I said. "Nora," he answered. "Thought I was done with this case, but the world don't like neat endings." I poured him coffee while he stood by the porch rail. Marin came out, wiping her hands on her apron. Ian toddled behind her, holding onto the hem of her dress. "There's been talk in Frost Creek," Reeves began. "Crow's people friends who weren't in the courtroom been stirring, saying the girl and the boy still got no rightful guardian, that the court's ruling was improper since the stepfather's estate crossed the border. They're talking about reopening the claim in Fort Lincoln." Marin's face went pale. "You mean they'll come again?" "Maybe," the marshal said. "Maybe not. The law's slower than a mule, but meaner once it gets moving. I wanted to warn you before rumors turn to riders. I felt the weight of it settle the old ache that comes when you realize peace was just an intermission." "What's your advice?" I asked. He studied me. "You could file a new petition, have the guardianship sealed under tribal law. I spoke with Running Bear last month. He said the Blackfoot would honor a hearing if you asked it proper. That would make any new claim near impossible to contest." Marin's eyes lifted. "Tribal law. Your grandmother was Blackfoot, wasn't she?" Reeves said gently. "Running Bear still remembers her name." She nodded quiet. "Morning Dove." Then he'll claim you as blood, Reeves said. And once he does, the children, he looked at the boy toddling toward the porch steps. They'll be his kin by law, and anyone who tries to take them will have to face more than paper. I looked out over the pasture, the light falling gold across the corn rows. We'll do it, I said. Reeves smiled faintly. Thought you might. He's holding a council 2 days' ride north near the river bend. Says you'll need to come alone, though, just you and the girl. No weapons, no tricks. You answer what they ask, and they decide if the bond you've made is true. Marin hesitated. What if they say no? Then the tribe keeps the children as wards, the marshal said. They'll be safe, but not yours. I nodded. Truth's all I've got left. Might as well put it to use. 2 mornings later, we left before dawn. I packed light coffee, salt, a blanket, and the rifle, though. I left it tied to the saddle when we reached the border, where the pine thinned into meadow. The trail to the Blackfoot camp wound through cottonwoods and open flats. Smoke from their fires rose steady in the distance, blue against the sky. When we arrived, the camp spread wide along the river's edge, teepees standing in a half circle around a central fire. Children played near the water, their laughter mixing with the rush of current. An old man waited near the entrance. Tall, wrapped in a blanket, dyed the color of rust. His hair was white as snow on stone. Silas Brennan, he said, his voice deep and even, and the girl Marin Gall. She stepped forward, her hands clasped. Chief Running Bear, she said softly. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. You have your grandmother's eyes, he said. Both of them, even the one that does not see. She was a woman who did not bow to winter. Marin's mouth trembled. You knew her. I did, he said. And she knew the price of survival. He turned to me. You brought the child into your home, fought to keep them, when men of your own color called them property. We have heard this. I did what I could, I said. What any man should. Few men do what they should, the chief answered. That is why we test. He led us toward the center fire where 6 elders sat, waiting faces lined by time and smoke. They gestured for us to sit. Running Bear spoke first. In our way, when a man seeks to claim what is not his by blood, he must answer 3 questions, and he must answer them true. Not clever, not brave, true. If he lies, we will know. The oldest elder, a woman with hair braided silver, leaned forward. First question, she said. You have lost a wife and son. Why do you seek to take these children as your own? I swallowed hard. Marin reached for my hand under the table of my knees. The truth came slower than I wanted, but cleaner than lies. Because grief leaves a hole, and living in that hole ain't living. I thought if I could fill it, I might forget. But the girl taught me better. She showed me that broken things don't need replacing, they need care. I don't want to replace my family. I just want to keep these children safe enough to grow old and make their own mistakes. The elder nodded, one's eyes softening. The next elder spoke, a man younger than the rest, though still gray around the temples. Second question, he said. The land you keep was bought by white men's law. Our people once walked there free. What will you teach these children about whose ground they stand on? I thought of the soil under our corn rows, dark as coal, rich because it held ashes, ashes of forests burned of bones, buried of people who had nowhere else to go. I'll teach them to remember, I said, not to own, to plant where they stand, but to know whose roots lie beneath. The elder looked at Running Bear, who gave a slow nod. Finally, the chief himself asked the last question. You fought for them. Would you still fight if it meant losing your freedom, if the law you trust turned on you? I met his gaze. Yes, I said, because freedom that lets children be stolen ain't worth having. For a long while, none of them spoke. Then Running Bear placed his hand on my shoulder. You have answered, he said, and you have answered true. The old woman stood. The tribe recognizes the bond between Silas Brennan and the children of Marin Gall. By our law, they are family. Marin let out a breath that sounded like the first one she'd ever taken without fear. I hadn't realized I'd been holding mine until then. Running Bear smiled faintly. You have new names now in our tongue, he said. You, Silas, are Broken Shield, the man who admits his cracks but still protects. The girl is Little Dove, the one who walked through snow and did not fall. When we rode home that evening, the world seemed wider. The river flashed silver under the sun, and the wind carried the smell of sage and thawed earth. Marin rode ahead, hair loose, the child laughing in her arms. I watched them and thought of Martha, of my boy, of every night I'd spent asking the sky for something I didn't deserve. Turns out mercy comes quiet without thunder or angels. Sometimes it just walks out of the snow half frozen carrying a baby. As the valley opened before us, the smoke from our chimney rose straight and clean. The worst of winter was behind, but I knew better than to think peace would last forever. Still, for that moment, it was enough. Summer came slow but sure, bringing the smell of wild sage and the sound of water running clear again. The land had shaken off its ghosts. The creek behind the barn widened, fat with meltwater, and the corn climbed past my knees before July. Mornings started with bird call instead of gunfire. Marin woke early humming the same tune her mother once did, baking cornbread, while the boy Ian toddled around the kitchen chasing the dog's tail. I'd seen years come and go on this stretch of ground, but that one felt different, less borrowed, more earned. Some nights I'd sit on the porch watching the horizon, where the mountains cut into the sky, and realize I'd stopped waiting for something terrible to happen. Marin changed too. The fear that used to live behind her eyes had thinned into something quieter, steadier. She'd talk about planting fruit trees, about maybe building a school near Frost Creek one day, so other children wouldn't grow up half wild and unlearned like she had. She didn't say it for pity, she said it like a plan. One evening, Reeves rode up the trail again, slower this time, a man with fewer battles left to fight. He dismounted and sat with me on the porch, hat in his hands. Been hearing stories, he said. Folks down in Frost Creek say the Gall girl's teaching half the valley's children to read. True enough, I said. She started with me. He smiled, the kind that tugged only one corner of his mouth. I figured she would. You've got that look about you now, someone who finally believes the sun will rise again. We sat quiet for a while, listening to the wind move through the corn. Then he said, Crow's gone. Gone. Died 2 months after the hanging was set. Fever took him in his cell. No family came to claim the body. Judge ordered a pauper's grave. I nodded. Then that's the end of it. As much as these things ever end, Reeves said. I came to tell you because endings ought to be spoken, not just left to drift. We drank coffee till the stars came out. When he left, the night felt lighter, like something had finally exhaled. The next day, Marin found me by the corral fixing the fence. She held out a letter, its seal broken. It's from the sisters at St. Clair's, she said. I wiped my hands and took it. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and dust. They wrote to say they'd heard the news that the orphan ledgers had been destroyed, that no one would ever again claim children the way Crow had. They sent blessings for the household at Frost Creek that turned a stranger into a daughter. I handed it back to her. Guess that makes it official. She smiled, eyes glinting in the sunlight. I was already sure. When autumn came, the harvest was heavy. The town held a fair for the first time in years, music cider. Even a preacher who could carry a tune. Marin set up a table with jars of honey and bread she'd baked. People came to buy and stayed to talk. I stood off to the side watching her laugh with the same folks who once whispered she'd brought trouble north. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a word you spoke. It was a season that arrived when no one was counting. After the fair, when the sky had turned the color of iron and the hills glowed red with the last of the day, we rode home slow. Ian was asleep between us on the saddle, small and warm. You ever think about what comes next? Marin asked. Next. When the boy's grown. When the farm runs itself. When we're just old. I smiled. I reckon that's the only kind of next worth wanting. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for a long time we said nothing. Years passed that way. Quiet, decent years. Frost Creek grew, built a church, a school, a telegraph office. The children we raised went on to raise their own. The ranch stayed small but full. Its fences mended its fields green. 40 years after that first winter, I sat on the same porch, my hands older than the wood beneath them, and watched the sun sink behind the ridge. The house had changed, the logs replaced roof retard, but the sound of the wind was the same. Marin's grave rested under the cottonwood near the creek, the one with her name carved, simple Marin Gall Brennan, 1866-1927. She walked through snow and did not fall. Ian visited every spring, bringing his own children, the youngest, with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's quiet stubbornness. He called me Grandpa, though the law had never written it that way. Sometimes he'd ask me to tell the story again, the one about the night the girl and the baby came out of the storm. I'd tell it slow, same as always. And when I reached the part where she knocked on the door, I'd stop, let the silence do its work. Because that's how mercy comes, I'd say. Not loud, not shining. Just a knock at the door when the wind's at its worst and a choice you make before you know, it's the one that'll save you. The evening light would fade and the coyotes would start up in the hills. I'd look out toward the cornfield's gold now swaying in the wind and think about how things grow back if you give them time and something to hold on to. And when the night finally settled, I'd whisper her name to the dark like a prayer, answered long ago but still echoing Marin the little dove who taught a broken shield how to live again.